The average house prices in the UK rose by a staggering 4.9% to £269,000 in January 2025, marking the fastest increase since January 2023 and up from a 4.6% increase in the 12 months prior. This is coming after the average UK house price jumped by more than £2,200 in a month back in 2024. In other news, UK debt interest spending for the coming year is reported to total £111.2 billion. That would represent 8.3% of the total public expenditure and be equivalent to over 3.7% of national income. Yet, this is the same country that once defined what a nation's prosperity should look like. A country that gave the world the Industrial Revolution and stood as a symbol of economic power. In one instance, millions of citizens are now struggling to afford necessities, as small businesses continue to close at a record pace amid rising tensions and budget tax cuts. So, what really happened to the UK? How did the world's fifth largest economy on earth fall into an economic trap that experts say could take decades to escape?
That the British government spends more than it raises in tax. It has done this for decades, and what that means, Gamal, is that it has to borrow.
When you walk through the streets of London today, the UK is still doing very well. There's the sight of towering skyscrapers, luxury apartments, and financial giants like Canary Wharf. Reports indicate that London alone generated approximately £618 billion in annual economic output in 2023. Accounting for 22.3% of the UK's GDP. If it were an independent country, London would rank as the 22nd largest economy in the world, ranking above nations like Argentina and Sweden. But here's the uncomfortable truth. London is just an outlier, and its wealth is not the UK's wealth. London and its surrounding region make up nearly half of Britain's GDP, while housing just about a third of its population. Outside the golden bubble, the picture looks much darker. In some northern towns in the UK, residents are struggling to cover their basic living expenses. The difference is just too glaring, and it is at the heart of Britain's economic fragility. Let's take a look at real disposable income, for example. This is considered the money people are left with after paying taxes and receiving benefits. In other words, this is the amount individuals can actually spend on food, bills, or save for the future. In the UK, this figure has remained essentially unchanged for over a decade. For 10 years, wages have consistently stayed flat when adjusted for inflation. And with prices soaring over the last 2 years, the situation could get worse. Imagine working hard for a decade and a half only to find yourself better off or even poorer than before. Food inflation reached its peak of 19.2% in March 2023 and has not yet returned to its pre-pandemic levels, according to the Food Foundation. How about energy bills? Well, that tripled during the energy shock that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and for many families, that meant choosing between heating and eating. And then there's housing, where the UK now has one of the least affordable housing markets in Europe. As of June 2025, the average house price in the UK was £269,079, while the average house price in London was £673,027. To add to this, the private sector isn't any better, as average rents increased by 8.7% in the 12 months to January 2025. Meanwhile, the UK also holds the record for the highest number of homeless people in Western Europe. This is a disturbing truth for a country that was once the symbol of stability and wealth. Behind these figures lies another disturbing trend of public services breaking down. It is no longer news that the National Health Service has been under severe pressure, with record waiting lists exceeding 7.6 million people as of mid-2024. Schools are equally facing funding delays and local councils are going bankrupt. So how did a global financial hub and a permanent member of the UN Security Council find itself in such chaos? Many might not be so observant, but the seeds of Britain's decline were planted long before the world noticed. And it all began with a single decision, which came after the 2008 financial crash. So let's talk about it. What actually was this decision? In 2008, the economy of nations around the world was taken by surprise.
Here's a look back at the roller coaster that was our nation's economy in 2008.
Banks were collapsing, markets were in freefall, and the UK was also on the brink of a financial disaster. To stop the country from bleeding, the UK government reportedly said it would make £50 billion of new capital immediately available to retail banks using taxpayers' funds. For a moment, this plan was successful, and the immediate economic collapse was averted. But the real damage was only beginning. When the financial dust settled, the government faced a painful decision. How would it pay for the massive fallout? That birthed austerity. Instead of pouring money into building the economy by supporting families and investing in growth, the UK chose to cut back on these efforts. This meant no significant tax breaks for households, no major job creation programs, and no substantial increase in the country's minimum wage. At first, it seemed responsible, but what followed was a decade-long period of economic stagnation. Between 2010 and 2020, the UK experienced its slowest growth in terms of living standards, meaning people were working and many businesses were operational, but the country's prosperity never seemed to return. This made many economists refer to it as Britain's lost decade. While countries like the United States and Germany bounced back strongly from the 2008 financial crash, the UK was at a standstill. For example, in the US, household income grew from $68,340 in 2009 to over $80,610 in 2023. But in Britain, that growth was significantly slower, mainly due to temporary boosts from COVID-19 support schemes. But why did austerity hurt the UK so much? Productivity, which is how much economic output you get for every hour you work, is the engine that drives visible growth. The more productive a country is, the more it can pay its workers without raising prices. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's productivity was growing by nearly 2% per year before the 2008 financial crisis. But after the crash, growth collapsed to almost zero. And because the government was slow to invest heavily in infrastructure, technology, and skills, the engine stayed broken. Compare this to countries that chose a different path. Germany, for example, invested heavily in its industrial base with training programs and green technology. The US also launched massive stimulus packages that boosted demand and technological innovation. The UK? Well, instead it cut public spending and hoped the private sector would pick up the slack. But it didn't. Many businesses held back, partly because they were also unsure of the future. The result was an economy stuck at a slow pace and unable to generate enough growth to lift or fund public services. In all of these, austerity didn't even fix the debt. Between 2008 and 2010, the financial crisis led to debt rising by close to 35% of GDP. So, the sacrifices of the past decade could be said not to have brought much. This failure set the stage for everything that came next, and the real tragedy was that it didn't have to be this way. When normalcy returned after the pandemic, most economies bounced back in one critical area: jobs. The United States saw a surge of new people returning to workplaces. Germany and France managed to restore their pre-pandemic employment levels. Even countries like Italy, which have long been plagued by structural unemployment, saw a new surge in labor participation. However, for the United Kingdom, it broke the pattern and simply went the opposite direction. Between 2019 and 2024, the UK unemployment rate was 4.7%, which translated to roughly 1.6 million people aged 16 and above. However, reality tells a very different story. And behind those numbers lies a more staggering truth. 22% of working-age people in the UK are classified as economically inactive. This means that they are not counted as unemployed because they are not actively seeking employment. Why is this number so high? Well, the reasons are complex, but they reveal a profound structural weakness in the labor market. According to the Office for National Statistics, out of this 22%, about 2.1 million students are between the ages of 16 and 24. That is expected in most economies, but the rate of non-full-time education participation has surged, partly because young people feel the job market offers too few opportunities worth entering. Another 3.5 million are people over 50 who have exited the workplace from a mix of early retirement or long-term illness. Some of these workers left during the pandemic and never returned. Why? The UK health challenge spiked after COVID, especially conditions like long COVID and mental health disorders. The ONS estimates that another 2.8 million people in Britain are currently out of work due to long-term sickness. Then there are caregivers who comprise at least 1 million people aged 25 to 49 who stay home due to family responsibilities. often caring for children or elderly relatives. The UK has consistently been among the top 5 most expensive countries for childcare. And for many parents, especially mothers, the math simply doesn't add up, and working would cost more than staying home. When you put all this together, you have a workforce that is missing millions of potential workers. This isn't just an unemployment statistic, but an economic time bomb. A smaller labor force means less income tax flowing into government coffers. It also means fewer people spending money in shops, eating in restaurants, or paying for services. It also means businesses cannot find enough staff, which forces them to raise wages to attract workers, and that, in turn, pushes up prices for everyone else. Industries across the UK are also feeling the heat. Hospitality chains have also reduced their operating hours because they are struggling to find enough waitstaff or chefs. Farmers have struggled to harvest crops on time because there are too few hands in the fields. Even the National Health Service faces severe staffing shortages, with tens of thousands of vacancies for nurses and care workers. So how did Britain attempt to rectify this? To fill the gap, the government opened its doors to more foreign workers. On paper, it was a win-win, as employers secured the workers they needed and the economy continued to move forward. But socially, it caused another problem. This sudden influx of migrants stirred up old tensions amongst many Brits. For years, immigration has been one of the most divisive issues in the UK government and politics. Brexit itself was partly fueled by promises to take back control of the country's borders. Yet here was the government increasing immigration numbers to solve a crisis that domestic workers could not or would not fill. By 2024, migration to the UK from other countries outside Europe had reached historic highs, and the political backlash was immediate. Anti-immigration and racist sentiment were growing louder, and extremist groups seized the moment. In early August 2024, the country erupted in riots across more than 10 towns and cities, triggered by anti-racism protests that turned into violence. Businesses were vandalized, and many streets turned chaotic to the surprise of the world. These riots were just a warning signal that economic policy, demographic shifts, and social cohesion were colliding in dangerous ways. This is the crossroads the UK finds itself today. A shrinking native workforce, a reliance on migration to keep the economy alive, and a society deeply divided over what that means for its future. The big question now is the UK economy heading toward a downward slope, becoming a third world country? What happens when its economics and identity collapse into such a state? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.